Very welcome to everybody. Good afternoon in Europe. Good evening in the Asia part of the world. Good morning in the American part of the world. A next Areopa webinar. I'm very happy that we can still find people to and find enthusiastic people to contribute to our webinars. And today we will be having as a guest James Pearson. James Pearson is the product manager of Clever Dynamics, building extensions only for the surely the UK market, but also beyond. That's of course the scope we're in nowadays with extensions. And he's going to present on what he has been working on for the approximately last couple of years, 2 years, and all before already also on C-side code to get code into automated processes. What does it mean to build an app for Business Central is the title of today's topic. He will present you what he's working on for his Clever Dynamics team as you could say infrastructure to support their development practices. But of course, he's the expert on his story and he will get to that. Before I hand off, let's say, to James, a couple of housekeeping rules. Probably seeing some of the names. I know many of you have been on the various webinars before. You know that your mic is muted, but we surely want you to participate in this using the GoToWebinar question window to post your questions. I will be the moderator of today and I will be picking up your questions. Either I might be answering them directly or I'll pick them up and be your voice towards James. So that's one part. Social media, I did push the link already. We are happy to have 3 recordings already to show you this is the channel we're on. As you see, we have at the moment 88 subscribers. It is a bit a mysterious URL still, but it seems to be the rule that as soon as we get 100 subscribers that we can apply for, let's say, a custom URL, which would be something like Areopa webinars whatever. So if you didn't subscribe yet to the channel, feel invited this way, so that it allows me to apply for a custom URL. You all know about probably our newsletter. This is the link to subscribe to the newsletter if you haven't or your colleagues hadn't. Feel welcome to do so, spread the word. And yes, on our website, you will find the upcoming webinars, which is, by the way, one of the next slides. Thanks to our sponsor, every time again, we're happy that Fornav is servicing us on this. Upcoming at the moment, one is planned. I'm working on more, but in 2 weeks' time, we will be here again. And then Tobias Fenster, the German MVP, will be discussing and one of our gurus on using containers in our development process, and he will pick up a part of his work on containers. So more to come. And this is the straight point in time where I will be handing off the presentation to James. I'm switching now, James, so you can pick it up and have fun.
Great, thanks, Luc, and hello, everyone. As Luc mentioned, I'm the product manager at Clever Dynamics. There's our Twitter handles and our online stuff if you want to check us out. Brief run through of what I'm hoping to cover this afternoon. I'm going to have a quick think about why you might choose to build in the first place. What are the benefits of implementing a build pipeline? And then 3 examples of a build pipeline. We're going to try and add a bit more functionality into the pipeline each time we come back to it. I'm sure you'll find that's the case if you do start implementing this yourselves. You will find naturally that the pipeline evolves over time. You will find different checks and tests and different steps that you want to factor in to the build, and it will become more comprehensive as time goes by. So a quick intro, and just to think about some of the terms, like most IT subjects, there's lots of acronyms that get thrown around with this subject. So CI, the CI part of CI/CD means continuous integration, which basically just refers to the practice of trying to get your code back into your master branch as soon as possible. So we want to avoid having features which are work in progress for months, and then you have a large task to merge that code back into the master branch. The idea is that the more frequently you can merge your code back in, the easier it will be, and the faster you'll get the features you're working on out to your customers. And the CD part is the theory that you are constantly in a state where you could push your code to a production environment. And the way that you are confident in doing that is because you've got a pipeline which proves that the current version of your code works. However you define works, you will likely have some automated tests. You're going to check that it compiles. You check that you've got dependencies that are present, so that you know at any moment in time we could release this code to a customer. And so the pipeline is just a series of steps that you're going to perform on a given version of your code. Whatever you need to do to prove that it works to your own satisfaction, those are the steps that should go into the pipeline. And YAML is the language that defines those steps, which we'll have a look at in a second. And you have an agent, which is just a machine running perhaps in Azure, perhaps that you host privately somewhere. For this webinar, I'm going to run the agent software on my own laptop. It's a machine somewhere that downloads the code and performs the steps that are defined in your pipeline. Just briefly, I wanted to think about what is the motivation for having a build pipeline in the first place. I do think it's quite easy to get sucked into best practices for their own sake. And it's easy to go to tech days or read blogs, or you feel that, well, we must start using Docker, and we must use Git, and we must use CI/CD and Scrum and pair programming and automated tests. But remember, you don't get paid for that. The customer, frankly, doesn't care how you've built the software. They pay you because you produce working software that adds value, however you're measuring that value, to their Business Central implementation. So to my mind, there are two reasons why you would build. The first is that it ensures consistency. You know that any version of your software that you release to your customers has gone through this defined series of steps. You know the code compiles, you know it publishes into a vanilla environment. You don't have that problem of it built on the developer's machine, but it doesn't build, or it doesn't publish when you come to the customer's environment because there were missing dependencies or missing objects or whatever it was. You know that it goes through a clean environment and works. You know that the automated tests have been run and that they do pass. Whereas if you just take the app file off the developer's machine, of course, it's possible they haven't run the tests, or it's possible that they have run them, but some of them failed, but they ignored it and they gave you the app file anyway. So this consistent approach gives you a greater degree of confidence that, yes, this software, to the best of my ability to test it, works. We can never be 100% sure that there are no bugs in the software that we release, unfortunately, because that's just the nature of writing software. But a build pipeline gives you greater confidence that what you're releasing actually works. And as I say, you will find that your pipeline evolves over time. Things that are easily overlooked, that perhaps are not compile errors in themselves, but are a necessary part of the working software. So I mean permission sets, or translation files, or a web service definition. anything else that ought to go into the app, but that would not cause a compile error in itself, those are the things that you can build into the pipeline. If you've forgotten them once, then stick them in the pipeline and you won't forget them again, because it's tested every time you run a build of your software. So that's why I think pipelines are valuable, and these are the tools that we're going to use today. They are not by any means the only tools you might use. You'll see in a second that you could host your source code in GitHub or even in Subversion or another external Git repository somewhere else. I'm using Azure repos and Azure pipelines, but those are not the only options. We're going to be using Docker because that allows us to create a predictable vanilla environment of a given version of Business Central that we can create and test our code against and dispose of again afterwards very easily. And the nav container helper PowerShell module that just makes working with Docker containers a little bit easier. Just a brief note about how you define the steps in your pipeline. If you start reading around the subject, you'll probably find there are different examples and different approaches. I don't think there is a correct approach necessarily. You could have PowerShell source files in your repository alongside your AL code. I'm going to be demonstrating having the PowerShell inline in the YAML file. That's an option. Or your PowerShell could be separate to the build definition. It could even be in a Visual Studio extension or in some other PowerShell module that you build and maintain separately, which is actually what we do with Clever Dynamics. We have a separate PowerShell module that is downloaded onto the build server. But there's different ways to approach the same problem. At the end of the day, all we're doing is downloading the source code and running some PowerShell steps on that code. All right, that's enough with the introduction, enough with the slides. Now let's jump into an example of what I'm talking about. I've got a very simple AL app here, which just adds an order origin field to the customer card, which is inherited onto a sales header record when the sell-to customer number is validated. What the app does is not really important. I've got a few tests that just demonstrate that the app does what I want it to. Of course, I've followed given when then and tried to do it properly as Luc is moderating the webinar. And I've got 3 tests that just demonstrate the app works the way that we want it to, which we will come to run in a second. I've got my code hosted in Azure repos, which is here. What I don't have yet is a pipeline. So if you hit the pipelines section, you'll see it gives me the option to create a pipeline. I don't have one yet. If we hit create pipeline, you'll see these are the options that you have for where your source code is hosted. In my case, it's in an Azure repo. It finds the order origin repo, which belongs to this project. I'll select that. And you can either choose an existing YAML file if you have one. I don't, so I'll say I'm going to use a starter pipeline. And you'll see it creates this basic YAML file. We'll have a look in a bit more detail at what these different parts of the YAML file are referring to in a second. But all we're doing is defining an Azure pipelines.yaml file, and that defines the steps that we want to run when we have a build. I'm not going to save that file for now because I want to show you one that I prepared earlier. So let's just merge in pipeline version 1. And here is my Azure Pipelines YAML file. What I will do is push these changes to the server because I want to get the build running because it will take a few minutes to run. Then we can leave that running while I talk you through the file. So now that I've pushed an Azure Pipelines YAML file, well, that's the wrong browser, we now see it's recognized that the repo does now include the definition of a pipeline. And I can come in here and say run pipeline. Which branch do you want to run it against? I've only got one at the moment, which is the master branch, so we'll choose that. I was wondering if I would get an error. You might find you get an error the first time you run because it wants you to authorize the pool that the agent is running against. The job hasn't started yet because the agent isn't running. I'm just running it in the command line here. So let's start that up. And you'll see the agent, I've already authenticated with a personal access token. I won't go through that now, but I've got a blog post about creating a personal access token. And it's picked up the job and it will start running that job. And you can drill into the details and see the logs that are being created as the build is being run. Come back to that in a second, but first, let's just have a look at the YAML file and see what it's all about. So first of all, the trigger section tells Azure DevOps when do you want this pipeline and the steps that it includes to be run. And master indicates I want this pipeline to be run whenever I push changes to the master branch. You can get a bit funkier with those options and include and exclude branch names and use wildcards. Or you could just have an asterisk to indicate that you want to run this pipeline whenever changes are pushed to any branch. The pool refers to the agent that is going to run this build. So live for Clever Dynamics, we have 3 agents that are in the default pool. So they're all listening for jobs and only one of them can pick up that job when they're ready. And that means you can run 3 builds simultaneously. You need a fair number of resources to run 3 concurrent Docker containers, run the tests, compile and publish the code. We have a server that we host ourselves for the purpose that we've given a chunk of RAM to. You can use the hosted Windows build agents, and you get a certain number of build minutes for free with your Azure DevOps organization, or you can pay to have concurrent jobs and an unlimited number of minutes. The reason I'm not building in a hosted agent today is because it's a clean Windows server. Each time it needs to download the Docker image for Business Central, which is 5 or 6 gigabytes. So that adds probably 10 minutes to each build. And given that I want to try and run a few builds and talk you through them within an hour, I'm doing it locally so I can save that time because I've already got the Docker image downloaded. So that's what the pool is all about. So my agent belongs to the default pool. Then I've specified a number of variables that I want to use in the steps that follow. And it's just convenient to specify them here so that you can set their value once and reuse them in the steps. And then the steps themselves, and you'll see most of them are PowerShell tasks. Incidentally, I should have said I have the Azure Pipelines extension for VS Code, which adds some IntelliSense and this tooltip to help you in building your YAML file. It can be a bit daunting at first when you've got a blank file. What on earth am I supposed to put in this file to define the steps? The documentation is pretty good actually at aka.ms/YAML. I've got a link to that at the end, but this VS Code extension helps as well. And this is what I was saying, I'm just defining the PowerShell that should be run in line in the build definition. Some people don't like that. Personally, I quite like to see in one file both the steps and the PowerShell that are going to be run by those steps. But really, it's whatever works for you. So first of all, I'm going to create a build container. This is where I'm using the nav container helper, and these are the options I'm going to use. Take the image name from the variable, use this license file, these are the credentials, etc., etc. Once that has been created, then the source code should be copied from the sources directory of the build into a folder where the container is able to access it. So that's what this step is doing. Incidentally, you'll notice a couple of different types of placeholder. This is for a variable I've defined at the top of the file. There are quite a few built-in variables as well. Stuff like what is the name of the branch that has triggered this build, where is the path that the code has been downloaded to or that you want to upload the artifacts to. Again, all of this is documented pretty well online. Then we want to actually compile the code, again using nav container helper and the compile app in nav container function. Assuming that has worked, then we are going to copy the .app file from the output of the compile function into the artifact staging directory. Might just be worth a quick look at what the agent folder looks like. So when you download the agent software, you get a zip file like this, and my command line is just running that run.command file. And whenever a job is run, let's pick one of these, you'll see the source code is downloaded and there are folders to copy the build artifacts into, and those paths you can access via these built-in variables. So I want to copy the .app file into the artifact staging directory. Then I want to check this app does actually publish and install into the container. That seems like a sensible minimum check that you'd want to do for a build. And assuming that passes, then this is the only task that is not a PowerShell task. It's a publish build artifacts task that will take the app file that we've previously copied and publish it back as an artifact of the build, and I'll show you what that means in a second. Up till now, all these tasks are going to run in series and will only run if the previous task has succeeded. The final task, I've got a condition that says I always want this task to run, and the task is to remove the Docker container at the end. So even if I've failed to compile the app, I still want to remove the Docker container last of all. So that is the YAML file, and would you look at that? It is downloading a new Docker image, which is what I was hoping to avoid. I downloaded the image as of about an hour ago, and clearly there's been another image that's been pushed in the meantime. So this will take a little bit longer to publish. Then we'll see it running the other steps that are defined in the pipeline, and all being well, we'll see the app file that is published back to the build as a build artifact. Seeing as we're going to wait for a second anyway, we got any questions so far? Is there anything needs clarifying?
There wasn't any question in the question window. I had a very simple question. In your scripts, or actually the PowerShell parts, you're multiple times are importing the module. Is that just to be safe, or is that because in this setup the module doesn't pertain somehow, or enough container?
Yeah, that's just because each task starts a new PowerShell session.
Yeah, okay.
So the nav container helper module is not present in that session until you explicitly import it.
Clear.
And it's worth noticing, although I've separated these commands onto separate lines, that's only to make it more readable. They're still treated as a single string that is the value of the inline script. So you do need semicolons to separate the separate PowerShell commands.
Yeah.
This greater than sign just tells the YAML file, I'm going to provide the value of this key over several lines. Otherwise, it's expecting the value will come on a single line.
Clear.
Okay. Well, let's wait for that to carry on running then. And in the meantime, let's go on to the next example and merge in pipeline with tests. So in the first example, we did a very minimal check of, can you download the source code? Can you build a container? Can you publish and install the app into that container? And assuming all of that works, we'll consider that the build has passed. Of course, given that we've gone to the trouble of creating some tests, it seems sensible that we'd want to run those tests and publish the test results back to the build as well, especially if some of them fail. You don't want to know just that some of your tests failed. You want to know which ones failed and the call stack at the time when the error was encountered, so that you can go and fix the failure. So what I will do now is push those changes to the master branch, which, as you recall, our pipeline says whenever there's a push to master, it should trigger a build. In fact, I've changed in between these versions of the file. I've changed the trigger so that any branch triggers a build. And the pipeline is exactly the same, but with the inclusion of these two steps. There's another PowerShell step, a bit more involved this time. All we're doing is preparing the default test suite with the test code units and test methods that should be run. There's a couple of approaches to doing that. One is you could have some install code in the code unit of subtype install that goes and finds your test code units and pushes them into the default test suite. We have created a separate AL extension to do that for us. I blogged about this the other day, and the .app file is shared on GitHub. So this step is downloading that build helper app from GitHub to a local path, and is going to publish and install that. The build helper exposes a code unit as a web service, and we want to create a client to that web service and call the get tests web service method, specifying the test suite name and a range beginning and end of code unit IDs that should be included in that test suite. Having done that, we can import the nav container helper again, and this time run the run tests in BC container function that is in the nav container helper module, specifying the container and the company. Here's the credential, and this is where I want the results to be saved to. That will generate an XML file in XUnit format, which is just a format that Azure DevOps recognizes that specifies test results, so that you can have an publish test results task, which is in the format of XUnit, and you need to look in this folder for an XML file and publish that as the test results. Assuming all the tests have passed and this is passed, then we also publish the build artifacts, and then again remove the build container at the end. Let's see how we're going. Hey.
Still busy.
Yeah, still busy. What? Okay, what I might do then is when I create the container with new nerve container, I've got the always pull switch included, which tells the module to always pull the latest image if it exists. So let's just commit that change. Say don't pull Docker image and push that. And if we go back to the pipeline, we'll see the initial job is still being run. This is the job that was queued first time I pushed the branch with the tests included. So what I'll do is just cancel that. And let's also cancel the current job. You see PowerShell popping up to remove the Docker container, because that step, you'll recall, always runs even if the previous steps have failed, and manually cancelling the pipeline counts as it failing.
I've got two questions, James.
Yeah, far away.
One from Dan Kinsella about the Git terminal. Is it on VS Code? Is that a separate extension or is it an onboard one?
In VS Code, this is just the built-in terminal to VS Code.
So that's the part one. Then a question from Yuri Popov. Whether it's possible to create a task which could be depending on some previous completed tasks using the YAML. So a sort of if-else kind of task.
I believe so. So you'll see there is a condition key, and you can define an expression that will be evaluated before this task is run, and if that evaluates to true, then the task will be run. You can make, can you make tasks? I don't think you can make tasks depend on one another, but I'll show you in the next example. You can have stages, which is a higher level of grouping, grouping your jobs together. A stage can depend on one or more previous stages, which may answer the requirement. So yeah, now that we're not always pulling the Docker image, then you'll see this is now going through the sort of thing you may well already be familiar with, creating a new Docker container. It's using the license that I've specified that's just on my desktop at the moment. And this is going to run through and still probably take another 5 minutes or so. So we'll check back in on that in a second. But the next example is using templates. So far, I'm working in the YAML file within my order origin repository and defining the build pipeline that I want to be executed whenever I make changes to this one repository, which is great. But if I then have a second repository where I'm working on a different app, but I want it to go through the same build pipeline, which is likely what you will want to do. If you defined a series of steps that works for one of your extensions, you're probably going to want to run that wherever you use a build pipeline. What will be useful is to extract these steps out into a separate file that we can reference, which is the next example. So let's merge into pipeline templates and I've got a conflict when I merge, but let's just have the incoming change. So now I've changed my pipeline, and all it now contains is the trigger, which is still there to say run this pipeline on any branch. And I have a reference to another repository, which is the templates repository, and I'll show you that in a second, and specifically the master branch. And now the definition of my pipeline is just a stages key. The job and all of the steps that are included in that job has gone. I've just got a stages and a reference to a YAML file in the templates repository. Remember, I got some parameters that were set in my previous pipeline, and you can still pass parameters from this pipeline into the template. So that's a useful way of being able to have a single pipeline definition, even if you need slightly different logic or a different Docker image or a different license file, whatever it happens to be, you can still have a single pipeline definition and just control the logic with some parameter values that you're going to pass into the pipeline. Let's just merge these changes properly. Merge template. Okay, great. So now let me show you the templates repository. And this is more or less lifted from what we had in the previous YAML file. The only difference is now, rather than having a single job, we've got a little bit of definition before that to say these are the stages that are included in my pipeline. And I have, at the moment, I only have a single stage, which I'm calling build, and that stage can include one or more jobs, which includes one or more steps. And when I push my changes from the order origin repository, this time it will pull in the steps from that template repository instead. I won't do that because that's a duplicate of the pipeline that's already running, essentially. So let's just see how we're going. Okay, good. Looks like we are done. Yeah. So you get a log of everything that has happened. You can see it checked out the source code. You can see it creating the Docker container and all the output you get from that. Copying the source into the container folder, compiling the app. So there it is, downloading the symbols, running alc.exe. If there's any output from alc.exe, if there's any warnings or compile errors, you'll see those in the output of the step. There weren't any errors, so we copied the app into the staging folder. The app did publish and install. Here's the tests being run. Oh. Yep, there they are. There's code unit 50102, and these are the 3 tests, and they ran successfully, and the test results were uploaded, the build artifacts were published, and the container removed. So if I come back a level, you can see 100% of the tests passed. By default, it's filtered to only show you failures, but you can take the filter off and see what ran. If any of these failed, you can click on them and you can see the error message and the call stack that led to the error message. So that's helpful in fixing them. You can create new bugs in DevOps, create a work item linked to the fact that the test failed if you use work items in Azure DevOps. And then you also have the .app file that was generated by the build uploaded to the published artifacts against the build. By default, these build results are kept for 30 days, I think. You can extend that, but it's probably best not to think of the build artifacts as being a solution for long-term storage of the different versions of your app. You should be keeping versions of your app that you want to release to customers somewhere else other than in the build pipeline, I would suggest. All right, so let's come back to the template and merge into my multi-stage pipeline example. And while I'm here, I will also change always pull so that we don't fall into the same trap again. And yeah, don't pull Docker, can't type, Docker image. And I'll push that to the template repository. In itself, that won't do anything because this is not a pipeline that will run in the template repository. If I was to look at the template repository just to demonstrate what I'm talking about, there are no pipelines in here. And also, there's no source code to run the pipeline against. There's only the build template YAML file. This is just a place to source control and keep a copy of the definition of my template so I can reuse it in other build pipelines. And let me start this build going. So I'll flick back to the order origin and I'll push the changes to that repository. So we ought to see, going back to order origin, a new build has started, and this time you'll see there are a couple of stages, and this is what I want to show you now. In my template file, as before, we've got the build stage. We've also got a release stage, which might answer Yuri's question, I'm not sure. Because I have a condition that says this stage should only be run if the source branch that has triggered the build is the master branch. So you might have feature branches or bug fix branches where you've got code that is separated off to one side, and you do want the build stage to run because you want the tests to run. Even if you're fixing a specific bug, you still want all of your automated tests to run to demonstrate that the fix that you've put in hasn't in fact broken something else. But it might not be appropriate to release that version of the code because you're still working on other fixes. In this case, I only want the release to run when I push a change to the master branch. And in order to do that, I'm running a special type of job called a deployment. Again, the agent that's going to run the deployment is the default agent, so my command prompt that's running. And we're going to release to an environment called release. Let me just show you that. Under the pipelines tab, there is an environment option, and I've created an environment called release. This could refer to a particular Business Central environment. If you've got a dev database, test database, live database, it could refer to a sandbox in a SaaS tenant, and then the production environment in a SaaS tenant. In my case, all release means is a folder on my local drive. I've just got a C release folder, which is empty at the moment. Because in our case, at Clever Dynamics, all we mean by release is making a .app file available somewhere. Because we are implementing our products through a reseller, we're not actually pushing the result of the build to anyone's actual environment. We're pushing it to a folder where they can get it for themselves. But you change the definition of release to whatever makes sense in your case. And again, it's just a series of steps that should be performed on a given version of your source code. The only difference being that rather than downloading a version of the source, it will download the artifacts that were previously uploaded by the build stage. You don't need to define that explicitly. That happens because it is a deployment task. And all I'm going to do is grab those artifacts and copy them into the C release folder. That could be pushing it to FTP or up to SharePoint. It could be sending someone an email, using the SaaS API to upload it to a SaaS tenant. Whatever you want to do when you release your software.
Would it also be possible to automate this to get it in the app source process, or acceptance process?
I would love to say yes. I believe the answer is no. I'm not aware of an API that allows you to submit to the partner center and update the offer. You would also need to be updating the parts of that offer that are not just the app file. So you need to update the version number. There's marketing content that goes alongside the offer. In any case, I don't believe there's an API to do that, but maybe that will come someday.
Camille is telling that there is indeed no API yet.
Yeah, shame. Right, so let's go back to the pipeline and see what's happening with the job now. It's still running the build stage. Now you'll see when you drill in, rather than just seeing the one job, you get a stages tab, which indicates we are proceeding from build to release. For the sake of time, I haven't done this, but if I was to push changes to a branch of order origin that is not the master branch, you would see that the release stage is skipped because the condition here has not been met. But we haven't got 5 minutes to burn just to show you that the stage is skipped. So I've pushed it straight to master, and we should see the build complete, and then the artifacts downloaded and end up with an app file in the release folder. And that, apart from just waiting for this to finish, that was all I was planning on showing. So unless there's any questions, we'll just show the output of this.
I've got one simple question myself. I was wondering, seeing your, let's say your portal here, why my portal has a build pipeline and you have a pipeline subsection. Do you know by any way or accidentally why there's a difference?
Because, let's just open this in a new tab. YAML pipeline definitions are still relatively new in DevOps, and I think
that's one of the preview. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Why didn't I open then? Preview features. Is this? I don't know why that's not opening. I don't know why I'm doing a demo in Edge either. That's probably the first mistake.
So probably it's a preview of new things coming up.
Yeah, I think you'll be able to see that as an option. Let's just quickly log in.
Camille is writing that the multi-stage pipelines are indeed preview.
Yes, and you'll find if you start reading around the subject, there are still quite a few features that are available in what they're now calling the classic pipeline experience compared to the YAML experience. I clicked on the wrong thing then. No. Preview features. Oh, here we go. Multi-stage pipelines. You turn that on, and then you will see the different menu options, I believe. If you were to click on releases, this is still what Microsoft call a classic release pipeline, where you define the steps in a more visual editor like this. So this is where you define, these are the stages, these are the environments, these are the steps I want to follow at each stage. And as I say, there are more possibilities with this classic pipeline, but Microsoft are adding more and more features into the YAML version at quite a rate. This looks like it's finished now, and we've got 2 ticks to indicate both the steps have passed, and jump into the release. Again, you get a log of what's happened. Download the artifact, as I said, and copy those artifacts into the release directory. So there it is. That's a very, very convoluted way of copying an app file from one folder to another on my local machine, but hopefully it proves the point that this folder could be any sort of environment you wanted to push your code to. And again, going back to the point at the start, we've got more confidence in pushing that code to a release because it's passed the tests, because we know it compiles in a clean Docker container, and you will add extra steps as you go. A few things that we have done, that you might want to consider. We also test, do all of the tables that are added by this app exist in the permissions file somewhere? Are the translation files complete, or have we added new captions to the US English file but not propagated them to the German, the French, the Dutch, whatever files? Silly mistakes that are easy to make because they don't cause the build to fail. Again, it's just PowerShell that you're running on your source code. So if it's something you can verify with PowerShell, it's something you can include in the build pipeline. Yeah, push your app files wherever they need to go, and do anything else that constitutes building or releasing the software in your context. Anything that helps you be confident this version of the software works, and now I'm happy to push it to an environment for further testing, or push it all the way into production. There's a few useful links there. I'm not sure the best way to share this. Maybe I'll give the presentation to Luc afterwards. And there's extra things. Sorry to just throw ideas at you now, but for instance, environments. incidentally, you'll see the release environment now says this environment is hosting the output of this build on the pipeline called order origin CI. So you've got a trace of what's in the environment, where it came from. You can follow that all the way back to the build, look at the logs, and see what's happening. You can add some checks into an environment. So you can say James Pearson must manually approve any builds that are going to go into this environment, and the build will wait in between the build and the release stage for me to come in and approve, yes, I'm happy for the app to be released into this environment. So there's a few different things, and as I say, they're adding new functionality all the time into the YAML pipeline.
Yeah, that's really great. James, I've got a question from Julien Rameau, if I pronounce it right. Literally, can we have a look at your branch, please, in the, related to branch policies that you're using? And then as an extra addition to it, what do you do with master, bug fixes, and cumulative updates?
Okay, so I don't have typically any policy on the branches other than what you get by default. I assume you're referring to prevent people from pushing directly to the master branch. Changes introduced to master must come via a pull request and that kind of thing. Those are useful options that we don't actually use currently at Clever Dynamics. We typically have a release branch, which we start with the number that is going to be the version number of the next release, and then a separate branch for each bug fix or new feature. And we try and keep those as small as possible so they can be worked on and integrated back into the release branch quickly. And once we've worked on all the bugs and the features that we've decided up front are going to go into that release, they're all merged into the release branch, and then the release branch is merged back into master at the end. I don't know if that answered the question.
That's a good question. That's up to Julien to, yes, it's okay. So great.
Okay, good.
You got the point.
Good. But while we're on the subject, although we don't enforce pull requests, virtually everything we write goes through a pull request. And if you're not already using them, I'd highly recommend you have a look at them and try them out. It's probably the single most useful change we've made to our development process, introducing pull requests. Yeah, it's been great.
Great. We have just a minute or a little bit more left. If there is anybody with a question, we could pick up the last one. Oh, here one from Julien too. Are you using boards, user story, tasks, bugs in this whole process of Azure DevOps side?
Yes, we do. We create bugs and product backlog items with tasks sat beneath them. We don't, to be honest, exploit the full potential of the work item tracking, but we do link our commits to Git branches with the work items. So you've got a track between these are the code changes that were made, and these are the work items that describe why the changes were made. So when you come to the pull request, you've got all that information to hand and all that context to be able to make a sensible decision about whether this code is okay to go or not.
Thanks, James. We're getting to the hour. Time to finish. And thanks from Julien for your answer also. Switching my screen. Yeah, finishing up. It was really great to have this story, James. You know, I've been in this too also for a long time, and I was very happy to also learn a couple of things for you. As said, the recording will be online, I hope tonight even. Share it, and with a couple of things, but surely with this, we need all to get on this. I don't know why we have been waiting for 10 years, why you could have been doing this already. But this is surely going to improve our practices. I think, James, that you can only support that. Thank you very much. Everybody have a good day, good evening, good night. And well, maybe we'll meet in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Luc.
Yo.